I have dramatically underestimated how many chapters are in this thing. Well, no matter. We'll do a few more. This is The First Circle by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Chapter 84, apparently, of 531. Never had Innocenti lived through such an interminable night. He did not sleep for a moment, and more thoughts crowded through his mind in that one night than normally occurred to him in a month. There had been plenty of time to think during the slow process of unpicking the gold braid from his diplomatic uniform, during the long wait sitting half naked in the bathhouse, and in the various boxes to which he had been confined throughout the night. He had been struck by the aptness of the epitaph pronounced on him, to be kept in perpetuity. For whether they proved he had made that telephone call or not, it had in any case obviously been monitored. Having once arrested him, they would never let him go. He knew what it meant to be in Stalin's clutches. It was for life. The prospect of being sent to a labour camp was tolerable, but thanks to his position, he might well be banished to a special place of monastic seclusion, where he would not be allowed to sit down all day and forbidden to speak for years on end, where no one would ever discover what had become of him, and he himself would be kept in total ignorance of events in the outside world, though whole continents might change their political allegiance and men might land on the moon. Prisoners held incommunicado could be quietly shot. It happened before. Was he afraid of death, he wondered. All that evening Innocenti had welcomed every minor event, glad every time the door had opened to disturb his isolation, his unfamiliar state of confinement. Now, in contrast, he wanted to be left alone to think things, some great idea which was hovering just beyond the fringes of his consciousness, and he was glad that he'd been put back in his previous box and left for a long time undisturbed except for the constant surveillance through the people. Suddenly he felt as if a thin veil were lifted from his brain, and he remembered clearly, and quite involuntarily, the thought that had been in his mind earlier that day, and the passage he had been reading. A belief in immortality arises from the insatiability of men's appetites. To the wise man, the term of our life is quite sufficient to encompass the whole gamut of pleasures to which we may aspire. If only pleasures were all that mattered. He had had money, good clothes, success, women, wine, travel, but now he was prepared to consign all these joys to perdition in exchange for one thing, justice. And there were all those others, unknown to him by sight or by name, walled up in the same building. How absurd to die without a chance to talk to them about the things which so disturbed his mind and spirit. How easy it had been for Epicurus to construct his philosophy under the spreading shade of a tree in that far-off era of immutable serenity and well-being. Now that Innocenti had neither pencil nor notebook, he treasured all the more the fragments which came floating up from the recesses of his memory. He recalled another passage. Physical suffering is not to be feared. Prolonged pain is never intense. Intense pain is never prolonged. Take his present situation. Cooped up, sleepless and airless for days on end in a box like this, unable to stand up or stretch his legs. Was this form of suffering prolonged or short-lived? Insignificant or intense? What about 10 years in solitary? Deprived of speech? In the room where he had been photographed and fingerprinted, Innocenti had noticed that it was nearly 2 a.m, and by now it must be 3 o'clock. A frivolous thought occurred to him, crowding out his serious reflections. His watch, which had been put in the prison safe box, would go on working until the spring was unwound, and then it would stop and no one would wind it up again. The hands would remain fixed until either its owner died or all his possessions were confiscated. He wondered what time it would be showing. Was Dottie waiting for him at the theatre? Waiting and telephoning the ministry? Probably not. Most likely the MVD had come immediately after his arrest to search the flat. It was such a big flat that it would take half a dozen men more than the whole night to search the place thoroughly. And what did they imagine they would find, the idiots? Dottie would get a divorce and marry again. His father-in-law's career would suffer from this blot on the family escutcheon. They would undoubtedly treat him as partly guilty by association. Everybody who had known Councillor Volodin would obediently erase him from their memory. He was being crushed by an implacable juggernaut, and not a soul on earth would ever know what became of him. And yet he wanted to live, to see what the future held. The world would be united, armies, frontiers would be abolished, a world parliament would be summoned, a universal president would be elected. He would stand bareheaded before the people of the world and say, "Pick up your things." What? "Pick up your things." What things? "That junk." Innocenti stood up, holding his overcoat and fur hat. They were especially dear to him now that they were his only garments which had not been ruined by the fumigator. The duty warden stepped back from the open door to make way for the dark, cheerful-looking features of an MVD sergeant major. As Innocenti wondered to himself how such men were recruited for a job like this, the man repeated the rigmarole of checking the prisoner's identity. Surname? Volodin. Name and patronymic? How many more times do you need to hear this? Name and patronymic? Innokenty Artemyevich. Year of birth? 1919. Place of birth? Leningrad. Pick up your things. He led the way, clicking his tongue in the approved manner. This time they went into a dark-covered yard and down a few steps. Thought occurred to him that they might be taking him off to be shot. They were always supposed to shoot people in cellars, and always at night. However, a saving thought comforted him in this moment of anxiety. Why, if they meant to shoot him, had they issued those 3 receipts? Well, he wasn't going to be shot. Innokenty still believed that all his jailer's actions were rational. Still clicking his tongue, the cheerful sergeant major led him into another building and through a dark lobby to a lift. A woman with a pile of ironed greyish-yellow laundry stood and watched over her shoulder as Innokenty was escorted into the lift. Although the young laundress was ugly, although she was his social inferior, and although she gave Innokenty exactly the same look of inscrutable stony indifference as all the other automata people employed in Lubyanka, at the sight of her, as with the girls from the safe deposit who handed out the pink, blue and white receipts, Innokenty felt humiliated that she should see him in this miserable, ragged state, and she might feel a contemptuous sort of pity for him. But this thought passed as quickly as it come, and what did it matter now? The sergeant major shut the lift doors and pressed a button for the destination, although none of the buttons were marked. As soon as the lift motor hummed into action, Innokenty immediately recognised it as the noise of that mysterious mechanical bone crusher which he had heard through the walls of his box. Cheered by this discovery, he gave a mirthless smile. The lift stopped. The sergeant major ordered Innokenty out onto a landing, and then along a wide corridor that swarmed with warders in blue epaulettes and white strips of rank. One of them locked Innokenty into an unnumbered box. It was, however, larger than the one before, a dozen odd square metres in area, dimly lit, with walls painted from floor to ceiling in olive green paint. The box or cell was empty and gave an impression of being dirty. It had a worn concrete floor and narrow wooden bench let into the wall that was just long enough to seat 3 people in a row. It was also chilly, which added to the general bleakness. The door contained the usual peephole, though its cover was seldom raised. From outside came the muffled tread of boots, a sign of the constant arrivals and departures which made up the busy nighttime life of a detention centre. Earlier, Innokenty had imagined that he was due to be permanently shut up in the cramped, hot, blindingly lit conditions of Box 8, where he could never stretch out his legs, where the light hurt his eyes and it was difficult to breathe. He now saw that he had been wrong, and instead he would have to spend his days in this large, depressing, anonymous box. His feet would suffer cold from the concrete floor. He would be tortured by the constant scurrying to and fro, by the shuffling of feet outside and the lack of light. If only there were a window, even a tiny one, even the kind of cell window that stage designers build for a prison scene at the opera. But there was none. However many stories one may hear, however many memoirs one may read, it is impossible to imagine the reality of prison. The corridors, the staircases, the innumerable doors, the officers, the sergeants, the domestic staff, moving ceaselessly to and fro in the busy nocturnal life of Greater Lubyanka. Yet with no more than 1 prisoner allowed out at a time, there is never a chance of meeting a fellow prisoner, of hearing anything other than words of command. Each prisoner is made to feel that the whole ministry is awake on his account alone, concerned with nothing but him and his crime. The first hour of his imprisonment are designed to break the prisoner down by isolating him from contact with the other inmates, so that there is no one to keep his spirits up, so that the full force of the whole vast ramified apparatus is felt to be bearing down on him and him alone. Innokenty's thoughts took a painful turn. He saw clearly that the telephone call, which only 2 days ago had seemed a noble act, had been merely stupid, pointless and suicidal. He now had enough space to walk up and down, but exhausted and confused by his treatment, Innokenty lacked the strength to do so. He paced the cell a couple of times and then sat down on the bench and let his arms dangle slackly beside his legs. He thought of all the good and great intentions that lay buried behind these walls, locked up in these boxes, and he cursed his own soft-heartedness. It was today or tomorrow that Innokenty should have flown to Paris, and he could then have forgotten all about the miserable creature he had tried and failed to save. As he imagined himself making the trip abroad that should have started the coming day, the thought of the utter finality of his loss of freedom took his breath away. At that moment he could have clawed at the walls of his cell in agony of frustration. He was, however, prevented from committing such a breach of prison regulations by the door opening. Once again his personal data were checked, to which Innokenty replied as in a dream, and he was ordered out with his things. As he'd felt rather cold in this cell, he'd put his fur hat on his head and thrown his overcoat over his shoulders. He made to leave the cell, unaware that by wearing his clothes in this way he might be concealing 2 loaded pistols or a couple of daggers. He was ordered to put on his overcoat with his arms in the sleeves and to hold his bared wrists behind his back. With the guard clicking his tongue as before, Innokenty was led to the staircase by the lift shaft and taken downstairs. In this situation, the most interesting thing that Innokenty could have done would have been to count the number of turns they made and see how many steps they took so as to reconstruct the layout of the prison. But his perception had become so blunted that he walked on unaware of his surroundings and of the number of steps they were taking. Suddenly, along another corridor, a tall warder came towards them, also vigorously clicking. The man escorting Innocenti hurriedly flung open the door of a green plywood cupboard which was blocking the already narrow landing, pushed Innocenti into it, and shut the door on him. Inside there was only just room enough to stand, and a feeble light came in from the ceiling. The cupboard appeared to have no top, letting the light in from a staircase well. The natural human reaction would have been to protest loudly, but Innocenti, who had by now grown used to the incomprehensible maltreatment and the silence which reigned in Lubyanka, obeyed without a sound, behaving in fact exactly as the prison system intended he should. And now at last he realised why the Lubyanka warders clicked their tongues. It was a warning signal that they were escorting a prisoner. One prisoner must never be allowed to encounter another, never be allowed to draw comfort or support from the look in his eyes. The other prisoner was led away, and then Innocenti was let out of his cupboard. It was there, on the steps of the last flight of stairs, that Innocenti noticed how deeply the steps were worn. He'd never seen anything like it in his life before. From the edges to the centre they were worn down in oval concavities to half their thickness. He shuddered. How many feet must have scraped over them to wear out the stone to such a depth? Of every two who'd passed that way, one had been a warder, and the other a prisoner. On the landing of the next floor was a locked door with a small closed window behind a grille. Here Innocenti was introduced to a new experience, being made to stand with his face to the wall. Even so, out of the corner of his eye he could see the warder press an electric bell, at which the pane was suspiciously opened and then closed. Then with much clanking of keys the door was opened, and the man who emerged from it, whom Innocenti could not see, began questioning him. Surname? Accustomed as all of us are to facing the person we're talking to, Innocenti naturally turned around, and just had time to catch sight of a puffy, fleshy man's face with a large red patch from his skull, and beneath the face a lieutenant's gold epaulets, before the man bellowed at him, "Face the wall!" He then went on with some weariness and set of questions, the answer to which Innocenti spoke to a patch of white plaster in front of his face. Having satisfied himself that the prisoner still admitted to being the person described on the card, and still remembered the year and place of his birth, the fleshy lieutenant rang the bell on the door, which had been locked behind him as a precaution. Once more the little window was drawn suspiciously back. Someone looked through the opening, closed the window, and opened the door with several loud turns of a key. "Quick march," said the fat lieutenant with the red scald mark on his face. They entered, and the door was locked noisily behind them. Innocenti just had time to make out 3 branching corridors, one straight ahead, one to the right, and one to the left, dimly lit with rows of doors, and close at hand on his left a table, a filing cabinet, and several more warders before the lieutenant gave him an order in a quiet but steely voice: "Face the wall, stand still." It was an absurd situation to have to stare at the dividing line between the olive green paint below and the white washed plaster above, feeling several hostile pairs of eyes on the back of your neck. After presumably checking his record card, the lieutenant announced in a near whisper that rang out in the silence, "Box number 3. A warder moved away from the table, and this time without the usual sound of clinking keys, set off along the burlap-covered floor of the right-hand corridor. "Hands behind your back, quick march," he rapped out in a low voice. On their right they followed the same olive-green wall around 3 corridors, while to their left they passed several doors marked with glazed number plates: 47, 48, 49. Beneath these were the covered peepholes. Excited by the thought that his companions in misfortune was so near to him, Innocenti felt an urge to push one of the covers back, glance through for a moment, and look in at the life inside the cell. But the warder was hurrying on, and although he had nothing more to lose, Innocenti was already too thoroughly under the influence of the greatest deterrent of all, the prisoner's instinctive sense of obedience, to do anything so rash. Unfortunately for us mortals, and fortunately for the powers that be, it is in the nature of a man that as long as he is alive, there is always something that can be taken away from him. Even a man serving a life sentence who cannot move, who is cut off from the sight of the sky, separated from his family and his property, can still be transferred to a damp cell in solitary confinement, deprived of hot food, beaten, and a man is just as sensitive to these refinements of punishment as if he was to his first violent overthrow from a pinnacle of freedom and well-being. So to avoid the pain of these ultimate penalties, a prisoner docilely carries out the hateful demands of a degrading prison regime which slowly destroys him as a human being. After the first bend in the corridor, the doors were closer together, and the glazed number plates read 1, 2, 3. The warder unlocked the door of box number 3, and with a wide sweeping gesture, which seemed out of place and slightly comical, flung it open. Innocenti noticed the oddness of the warder's behaviour and looked at him. He was a short, broad-shouldered lad, with straight black hair and eye sockets slashed crookedly into his face as though with a slanting blow from his sword. He had an ugly look about him, with unsmiling eyes and lips. But of the dozen or so expressionless Lubyanka faces that Innocenti had seen that night, there was something about this warder's evil face that he liked. Locked inside the box, Innocenti looked round. and by now he was something of a connoisseur of prison cells, having been in enough of them to draw comparisons. This box was a paradise, 3.5 paces wide, 7.5 in length, with parquet floor, one side almost completely taken up with a long and reasonably broad wooden bench fastened to the wall, with a small freestanding hexagonal table near the doorway. The box, of course, had no windows, only a small ventilation grating halfway up the wall. It was also very high, 3.5 meters from floor to ceiling, and the whole of the wall was whitewashed, gleaming from a 200-watt bulb in a wire casing over the door. The lamp warmed the box, but it was painfully bright. Prisoners learn fast, and their knowledge sticks. This time Innocenty had no illusions. He did not expect to stay long in this comfortable box. But as he looked at the long bare bench, with his fast-growing prison experience, he realised that his first and main need was sleep. Just as a young animal deprived of its mother will instinctively fend for itself, so Innocenty quickly discovered how to make a bed out of his overcoat, folding the astrakhan collar and the sleeves into a makeshift pillow. He lay down, and finding it very comfortable, he closed his eyes and settled to sleep. But he could not sleep. He had so longed to be able to fall asleep earlier when it had been impossible, but he had passed through every stage of tiredness, had twice dropped into momentary sleep, that now he could not sleep. The sleep refused to come. The constant spasms of arousal had so unsettled him he found it impossible to relax. Fighting off the wave of thoughts, regrets and reflections, Innocenty tried to breathe evenly and count to himself. This inability to sleep was infuriating now that he was warm, the bench felt quite comfortable, his legs were fully stretched and the warder for some reason was leaving him alone. After lying like this for a half an hour, his thoughts began at last to lose coherence and a comforting warmth started creeping over his body. It was then that Innocenty realised he could not possibly sleep in that insanely bright light. Not only did the light penetrate his eyelids with an orange glow, but he could actually feel it pressing with unbearable force against his eyes. This physical pressure of light, which Innocenty had never noticed before, drove him to a fury, turning in vain from side to side to find a position in which the light did not press on his eyes. Innocenty gave up in despair, sat up and put his feet on the ground. The cover of his peephole was raised frequently. He could hear the noise it made, and the next time it was opened, he quickly raised his finger. The door opened noiselessly. The squinting warder looked at Innocenty. "Please turn the light off," said Innocenty. "I'm not allowed to," said the warder. "Well, change the bulb then. Put in one that's not so bright. What's the use of such a powerful bulb in such a small box?" "Don't talk so loud," said the warder quietly. The huge corridor behind him and the whole prison were as silent as the grave. "The lamp has to be that bright. Prison regulations." Innocenty had been right. There was a spark of life behind that death-like face. Having exhausted this topic of conversation and guessing that the door would immediately be closed, Innocenty said, "Fetch me a drink of water, please." The man with the squint nodded and locked the door without a sound. He walked noiselessly away from the box, along the burlap-covered floor, and returned with only the faintest grating of the lock. Stood in the doorway with a mug of water. As on the ground floor of the prison, the mug was decorated with a picture of a cat, but this cat had no spectacles, no book and no bird. Innocenty drank gratefully, and as he paused to draw a breath, he looked up at the warder. The man had taken one step into the room, shut the door as far as the width of his shoulders permitted, and with a thoroughly non-regulation wink, he asked, "What were you outside?" How odd it sounded, the first human remark of the night. Moved by the lively curiosity in the man's voice, by the low tone he used as a precaution against being overheard by someone in authority, and aroused by the unintentional callousness of that little word "were," Innocenty whispered, "Diplomat. Rank of councillor." The man with the squint nodded sympathetically. "I used to be a sailor in the Baltic Fleet." He paused. "Oh, what are you in for?" "I've no idea," said Innocenty. "For nothing at all, as far as I know." The warder nodded sympathetically. "They all say that at first," he said. "Do you want to go to the, Oh, no thanks," said Innocenty, not realising in his innocence that the offer had been made to him was the greatest privilege that a warder could grant, and that for the prisoner one of the greatest joys on earth is to be allowed to relieve himself outside the regulation times. After this interesting conversation, the door was shut, and Innocenty stretched out on the bench again, struggling in vain against the light pressing in through his defenceless eyes. He tried covering them with his hand, but the hand slipped away. He realised how convenient it would be to fold his handkerchief into a strip and cover his eyes with it. But where was his handkerchief? Oh God, why didn't he just pick it up? What a stupid fool he'd been only a few hours ago. It's the little things, a handkerchief, an empty matchbox, a piece of thread, or a plastic button, that are the prisoner's best friends. There will always come a time when one of them is suddenly indispensable for getting out of a tight spot. Suddenly the door opened, and the squint-eyed warder handed Innocenty a great bulging red checkered mattress. It seemed like a miracle. Far from preventing him from sleeping, Lubianka was actually taking trouble over a prisoner's sleep. Rolled up on the mattress was a small down pillow, a pillow slip and a sheet, both stamped detention centre, and even a blanket. It was bliss. Now he could sleep. His first impressions had made him judge the prison too harshly. With pleasurable anticipation, and for the first time in his life, He pulled the slip over the pillow, made up his bed, because the bench was just too narrow and the mattress hung slightly over the edge, undressed, lay down, covered his eyes with the sleeve of his tunic, and now he lacked nothing. He was just beginning to drift off into that deep sleep once known as the arms of Morpheus, when the door opened with a crash and Squint Eyes said, "Take your arms out from under the blanket." "Take them out," said Innocenty. "Why did you have to wake me up? It's very hard for me to get to sleep." "Take your arms out," said the warder. "Your arms must be outside the bedclothes." Innocenty did as he was told, but it proved to be no easy matter to fall asleep while keeping his arms above the blanket. It was a diabolical rule. A person's natural, ingrained habit is to keep his arms covered when he sleeps, to hold them close to his body. For a long time, Innocenty tossed restlessly as he adapted himself to yet another form of humiliation, but sleep won. A delicious numbness began to steal over his mind. Suddenly he heard a noise along the corridor. Starting in the distance and drawing nearer came the sound of cell doors being slammed, accompanied each time by a shouted word. There it was next door. And then Innocenty's door was opened too, and the ex-sailor from the Baltic announced mercilessly, "Réveil!" "What? Why?" said Innocenty. "I haven't slept at all." 6 o'clock, time to get up," said the sailor, and moved on to the next cell. The desire to sleep now overcame Innocenty with peculiar force. He collapsed onto his bed and fell asleep instantly, but was only able to stay asleep for a minute or two before Squint Eyes noisily flung the door open and said, "Réveil! Roll up your bedding." Innocenty raised himself on one elbow to stare at his tormentor. Only an hour before it seemed so likeable. "But I haven't slept at all, don't you realise? That's none of my business." "All right, I'm going to get up and roll my bedding. What happens then?" "Nothing. Sit there." "Why?" "Because the rule is réveil at 6. "Well, then I'm going to sleep sitting up." "I won't let you. I'll wake you." Innocenty clutched his head and rocked from side to side. Something that might have been sympathy showed in the warder's face. "Do you want to wash?" "All right," said Innocenty after a moment's reflection. "Hands behind your back." The latrines were around the corner. Despairing of getting any more sleep that morning, Innocenty took the risk of stripping to the waist and thoroughly washing himself in cold water. He could splash around as much as he liked on the concrete floor of the large, chilly latrine, with the door locked and without interruption from the warder. The man might be human, but why had he been so underhand as to not warn in advance that réveil was at 6 o'clock? The cold water banished the stupefying lassitude caused by Innocenty's interrupted sleep. In the corridor he tried asking about breakfast, but the warder cut him off. Back in the cell, he replied, "There's no breakfast." "What? We don't get anything to eat?" "At 8 o'clock there's rations, tea and sugar." "What's rations?" "It means bread." "And when's lunch?" "Not allowed. Supper's the next meal." "What am I supposed to do? Just sit here all the time?" "Well, that's enough talking." Innocenty just had time to raise his hand before the warder had fully closed the door. "What is it this time?" said the sailor. "My buttons have been cut off and the lining's been ripped out of my coat. How can I get them mended?" "How many buttons?" They counted them and the door was shut. After a short while it was opened again. Squint Eyes handed over a needle, a dozen separate pieces of thread, and a few buttons of various sorts and sizes, some bone, some plastic, and some wooden. "Well, these are no good. Where are my buttons?" "Take them and shut up or you won't even get these," said the warder. For the first time in his life, Innocenty began to sew. It took him some time to discover how to stiffen the end of the thread, how to stitch, how to finish off sewing a button. Without the benefit of thousands of years of accumulated human experience, Innocenty discovered the art of sewing all over again. He pricked himself so often that his tender fingertips began to hurt. He spent a long time sewing the lining of his tunic back into place and restoring the torn-out padding of his overcoat. He sewed some of the buttons on in the wrong places, so that the hem of his tunic hung in wrinkles. But this absorbing, unhurried task not only made the time pass, it completely restored Innocenty's peace of mind. His anxiety subsided, his sense of fear and persecution ebbed away. It became obvious that even this legendary chamber of horrors, the greater Lubyanka, was not so terrible after all. There were people living in it, whom he longed to meet, and he'd made a great discovery, that a person who has not slept all night, who is hungry, and whose life has been turned drastically upside down in the space of a few hours, is granted his second wind, just as an athlete's aching body revives to a new access of freshness and strength. The warder, a new one this time, took away the needle, and soon afterwards he was brought a pound of moist black bread, with a triangular extra slice to make it up to the regulation weight, and 2 lumps of sugar. And then they poured him out a mugful of hot, strong tea, and told him he could have more if he wanted. The time was 8 o'clock in the morning, on December the 27th. Innocenty tipped his whole day's ration of sugar into his mug, and stupidly tried to stir it with his finger, but found that it was too hot. And then after stirring it by swilling it around the mug, he drank his tea with relish. He didn't want to eat anything, and he asked for more by raising his hand. As the second mugful lacked sugar, he tasted the flavour of the tea even more strongly, and Innocenty gulped it down with a shiver of pleasure. His mind now took on a rare degree of clarity. In expectation of the forthcoming battle of wits, he began walking up and down in the narrow space between the bench and the opposite wall, squeezing past his rolled-up mattress. 3 short paces forward, 3 short paces back. He recalled another aphorism of Epicurus, which no one had so far refuted, and which only yesterday, still a free man, he had found so hard to grasp. The highest criteria of good and evil are our own feelings of pleasure or displeasure. In other words, according to Epicurus, only what I like is good and what I do not like is evil. This was the philosophy of a savage. Because Stalin liked killing people, did this mean that he regarded killing as good? And if someone found displeasure in being imprisoned for having tried to save another man, was his action therefore evil? No. For Innocenti, good and evil were now absolute and distinct, and visibly separated by the pale grey door in front of him, by those whitewashed walls, by the experience of his first night in prison. Seen from the pinnacle of struggle and pain to which he was now ascending, the wisdom of Epicurus seemed no more than the babbling of a child. The door opened with a crash. "Surname!" barked another warder, this time a man of Asiatic appearance. "Volodin." "Interrogation! Hands behind your back!" Innocenti clasped his hands behind his back, and holding his head up like a bird drinking, marched out of his box.